The Vietnam War is often described as the conflict America didn't understand. That framing is inaccurate. America understood the war. It chose to misrepresent it. What follows are 20 documented realities from the Vietnam War that were suppressed, obscured, or denied by the institutions that directed it. These are not interpretations. They are recorded events that existed outside the official narrative while that narrative was being constructed. The gap between what happened and what was reported wasn't accidental. It was structural. In 1965, the United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam introduced a metric called the body count. The body count was intended to measure progress in a war without territorial objectives. If ground couldn't be held, dead bodies could be tallied. The problem emerged immediately. There was no reliable method to distinguish between combatants and civilians in the field. The pressure to produce favorable numbers was institutional. Units that reported higher body counts received commendations. Units that reported lower body counts were questioned. The incentive structure was clear. Within months, the body count became a performance metric detached from reality. Commanders inflated figures. Soldiers were told to reclassify civilian deaths. Water buffalo were counted as enemy supplies destroyed. By 1967, MACV intelligence analysts were writing internal memos stating that the body count was statistically impossible. The numbers being reported exceeded the estimated size of the Viet Cong infrastructure in certain provinces by multiples. The memos were filed. The body counts continued to be released to the press as evidence of progress. The policy wasn't adjusted. The metric replaced the truth it was meant to measure. Operation Ranch Hand began in 1962. The objective was defoliation. Herbicides were sprayed across South Vietnam to eliminate jungle cover and destroy crop production in areas controlled by the Viet Cong. The program used multiple chemical agents. The most widely deployed was a mixture of 2 herbicides in equal parts, stored in barrels with orange identification stripes. Between 1962 and 1971, the United States Air Force sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over South Vietnam. The operation was not classified. It was reported in general terms. What was not reported was the contamination level of the herbicides being used. The manufacturing process created a dioxin compound as a byproduct. The compound was not intentionally added. It was a result of accelerated production schedules and inadequate temperature controls during synthesis. The dioxin was not removed. Military officials were aware that the herbicide contained it. Internal correspondence from the Department of Defense in 1967 acknowledged that the substance posed potential health risks. The spraying continued for 4 more years. Veterans who handled the herbicide or operated in sprayed areas began reporting illness within years. The Department of Veterans Affairs denied the connection for decades. The chemical manufacturer's own studies, conducted in the 1970s, confirmed the dioxin's toxicity. Those studies were not made public until litigation forced disclosure in 1984. Approximately 3 million Vietnamese civilians lived in areas that were directly sprayed. There is no comprehensive long-term health study of that population. Free fire zones were established across South Vietnam beginning in 1965. A free fire zone was an area where military personnel were authorized to shoot any person without prior clearance or identification. The zones were designated in regions believed to be under Viet Cong control. Civilian populations were supposed to be evacuated before a zone was declared. Evacuation procedures were inconsistent. In some cases, leaflets were dropped. In other cases, warnings were not issued. The assumption underlying the policy was that anyone remaining in a free fire zone was hostile. The assumption was incorrect. Many civilians could not relocate. Some did not receive warnings. Others could not travel due to age, illness, or lack of resources. Some had nowhere to go. The policy was not publicly defined during the war. It was referenced obliquely in after-action reports. Soldiers operating in free fire zones were instructed that engagement rules were simplified. Anything that moved could be engaged. By 1968, free fire zones covered thousands of square miles. The civilian casualties resulting from this policy were not separately tracked. They were aggregated into broader casualty reports or classified as enemy combatants. The policy was legally ambiguous under the Geneva Conventions. Internal military legal reviews raised questions about its compliance with international law. The reviews did not alter the policy. The zones remained active until the American withdrawal. The Phoenix program was a pacification effort targeting the Viet Cong infrastructure in South Vietnam. It was initiated in 1967 under the joint command of the Central Intelligence Agency and MACV. The stated objective was to identify and neutralize Viet Cong political organizers, tax collectors, and supply coordinators embedded in villages. Neutralization was defined as capture or elimination. The program relied on intelligence provided by South Vietnamese informants. The quality of the intelligence was inconsistent. Provincial interrogation centers were established to process captured suspects. Torture was used during interrogations. The use of torture was not denied internally. CIA officers documented methods including electric shock, waterboarding, and prolonged stress positions. These methods were described in field reports as necessary for extracting actionable intelligence. The oversight structure was weak. Many interrogations were conducted by South Vietnamese personnel with American advisors present. The threshold for designating someone as Viet Cong infrastructure was low. Personal disputes, rivalries, and false accusations generated names. Between 1968 and 1972, the Phoenix program documented the neutralization of over 26,000 individuals. The number killed was over 20,000. The number who were actually Viet Cong operatives remains unknown. South Vietnamese officials later acknowledged that a significant percentage of those targeted were misidentified. The program was defended by its architects as effective. Effectiveness was measured by the number of neutralizations, not by the accuracy of targeting. The My Lai massacre occurred on March 16, 1968. American soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, entered the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. They were told the village was a Viet Cong stronghold. No enemy fire was encountered. Over the course of 4 hours, soldiers killed between 300 and 500 unarmed civilians, including women, children, and elderly men. Some victims were sexually assaulted before being killed. Others were mutilated. The killing was systematic. Groups of villagers were rounded up and shot in ditches. Homes were burned. Livestock was slaughtered. A helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson, witnessed the massacre from the air and intervened by landing his helicopter between soldiers and fleeing civilians. He ordered his crew chief to open fire on American troops if they attempted to harm the civilians. Thompson reported the incident immediately upon returning to base. His report was received and filed. No immediate action was taken. The massacre was covered up by officers in the chain of command. The initial after-action report described the operation as a success and claimed enemy combatants had been killed in action. One soldier, Ron Riddenhauer, heard about the massacre from members of Charlie Company a year later. He spent months gathering testimonies and sent a letter detailing the killings to 30 members of Congress, the Pentagon, and the White House in March 1969. The letter triggered an internal investigation. The investigation was conducted quietly. In November 1969, journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story publicly. The photographs taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberle were published shortly afterward. Public outrage followed. 26 soldiers were charged with criminal offenses. Only one, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. The sentence was reduced to 20 years. He was released after serving 3.5 years under house arrest. The massacre was not an isolated incident. It was the most thoroughly documented. The policy of search and destroy was implemented across South Vietnam throughout the war. The objective was to locate enemy forces, engage them, and withdraw. Ground was not held. Villages were not secured. The operation was repeated in the same areas multiple times. The strategy assumed that attrition would weaken the enemy faster than it weakened American forces. The assumption was incorrect. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces controlled the timing of most engagements. They initiated contact and withdrew before artillery or air support could be effectively deployed. American units suffered casualties during these engagements and often had no tangible objective to show for them afterward. The same villages were raided repeatedly. Civilians in contested areas were caught in a cycle of searches, interrogations, and destruction. Homes were burned during search operations on the suspicion they housed Viet Cong. Food stores were confiscated or destroyed. The rationale was to deny resources to the enemy. The effect was to alienate the civilian population and drive recruitment for the Viet Cong. By 1968, American commanders privately acknowledged that search and destroy was not achieving strategic objectives. The policy continued until 1969, when it was officially rebranded as Clear and Hold, though operational patterns changed little. Drug use among American soldiers in Vietnam was widespread. Marijuana was readily available and inexpensive. By 1967, usage was common. Heroin became widely available starting in 1969. The heroin was high purity, inexpensive, and sold openly in areas near bases. Soldiers used it to manage stress, boredom, and fear. The military's initial response was inconsistent. Commanders were aware of the problem, but reluctant to address it aggressively because drug testing and enforcement would reduce the number of available troops. By 1970, the Department of Defense estimated that over 30% of enlisted men in Vietnam had used heroin. Some estimates within the military were higher. Drug use impaired unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. Overdoses occurred. Addiction became a significant issue for returning veterans. The military began implementing urinalysis testing in 1971. Soldiers who tested positive were offered treatment rather than court-martial. But the testing was announced in advance, allowing users to abstain temporarily. The scale of the problem was not publicly acknowledged until after the war. Fragging was the term used to describe the killing or attempted killing of an officer or non-commissioned officer by his own men, typically using a fragmentation grenade. The term emerged in Vietnam. Fragmentation grenades left little evidence of the perpetrator. Fragging incidents increased sharply between 1969 and 1971 as morale deteriorated and the American withdrawal became evident. Soldiers targeted officers who ordered risky patrols, enforced strict discipline, or were perceived as prioritizing career advancement over troop safety. The actual number of fragging incidents is difficult to establish. The Department of Defense documented over 800 confirmed or suspected fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972. The real number was likely higher. Many incidents were not reported or were reported as accidents. Officers and senior NCOs became cautious about issuing unpopular orders. Some units became effectively ungovernable. The threat of fragging undermined the authority structure in certain units and contributed to a collapse in discipline during the final years of American involvement. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army operated an extensive tunnel network beneath South Vietnam. The most famous was the Cu Chi tunnel system northwest of Saigon. The tunnels were used for movement, storage, medical care, and shelter from bombing. American forces developed specialized units called tunnel rats to explore and clear these tunnels. Tunnel rats were soldiers, usually of small stature, who volunteered or were assigned to enter tunnels armed with a flashlight, a pistol, and sometimes a knife. The tunnels were narrow, dark, and often booby-trapped. Tunnel rats encountered enemy soldiers in close quarters underground. Fighting occurred in complete darkness in spaces too small to maneuver. Many tunnel rats were killed or wounded. The psychological toll was severe. There was no protocol for managing the stress of repeated tunnel missions. Some tunnel rats refused to continue. Others exhibited signs of acute psychological trauma. The military did not provide specialized mental health support for these soldiers. Their experiences were not widely documented during the war. Many tunnel rats did not discuss their experiences after returning home. Operation Speedy Express was conducted by the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta from December 1968 to May 1969. The operation was intended to clear Viet Cong forces from the region using aggressive firepower and rapid mobility. The division reported killing nearly 11,000 enemy combatants during the operation. Approximately 750 weapons were captured. The ratio of killed to captured weapons was approximately 15-1. A typical ratio in other operations was closer to 3 or 4-1. The discrepancy suggested that a significant number of those killed were unarmed. Newsweek reporter Kevin Buckley investigated the operation in 1971 after the division had redeployed. Buckley interviewed villagers and reviewed casualty data. His investigation concluded that thousands of civilians had been killed during Speedy Express. Buckley's findings were published in a cover story in June 1972. The military did not dispute the civilian death toll, but stated that the operation had been successful in reducing Viet Cong activity. No disciplinary action was taken. The commander of the 9th Infantry Division during Speedy Express was later promoted. The Sun Mai village complex, which included My Lai, was not the only site of mass civilian killings by American forces. Another incident occurred in the same area on the same day at the sub-hamlet of Mai K, committed by a different unit. Over 90 civilians were killed at Mai K. The killings were overshadowed by the larger massacre at My Lai and received minimal attention during subsequent investigations. Additional incidents occurred throughout the war. In February 1968, soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division killed civilians in the village of Trio Ai. The incident was reported by Army photographer Ronald Haberle, the same photographer who documented My Lai. The Trio Ai killings were not prosecuted. In 1969, members of a reconnaissance platoon were accused of executing a 16-year-old Vietnamese girl. The case was investigated, but no convictions resulted. The common thread in these incidents was inadequate command oversight, unclear rules of engagement, and a culture that prioritized body counts over adherence to the laws of war. The vast majority of these incidents were never publicly reported. American soldiers stationed in rear areas experienced the war differently than those in combat units. Rear echelon soldiers faced less direct danger, but were not immune to psychological stress. The disparity between rear and frontline experiences created tension within the military. Combat troops resented non-combat troops. The resentment was expressed openly. Rear area bases were targeted by rocket and mortar attacks. These attacks were irregular, but frequent enough to create persistent anxiety. Soldiers in rear areas developed a sense of randomness around survival. The attacks were rarely accurate, but they were unpredictable. This randomness eroded the sense of security that rear positions were supposed to provide. Alcohol abuse was common in rear areas. Recreational drug use was widespread. Discipline was inconsistent. The environment was not conducive to maintaining military order. Some rear area bases resembled chaotic transit camps rather than military installations. The disorder was rarely documented in official reports. The air war over North Vietnam was governed by a targeting approval process that required political authorization for most strikes. The process was intended to prevent escalation and avoid civilian casualties. The result was a slow, bureaucratic system that limited operational effectiveness. Pilots were restricted from striking certain targets, including power plants, fuel depots, and transportation hubs, until authorization was granted from Washington. Authorization was often delayed or denied. Pilots flew missions into heavily defended airspace under restrictive rules of engagement that prohibited them from attacking anti-aircraft sites until those sites fired first. The restrictions increased the risk to pilots without corresponding strategic benefit. Many pilots expressed frustration with the targeting restrictions. Some considered the restrictions tactically indefensible. The air war was paused multiple times for political reasons, allowing North Vietnam to repair damage and reinforce defenses. The bombing campaign, called Operation Rolling Thunder, lasted from 1965 to 1968 and dropped more tonnage than was used in the entire Pacific Theater during World War II. It did not achieve its strategic objectives. The North Vietnamese transportation network was disrupted but not destroyed. War materiel continued to flow south. The bombing was resumed later under different operations with similar results. The effectiveness of the air campaign remained contested within the military throughout the war and afterward. Soldiers who refused orders in Vietnam faced court-martial. Some refusals were based on moral objections. Others were based on the perception that certain orders were suicidal. The legal standard for refusing an order was narrow. An order had to be clearly illegal under military law. An order that was dangerous or ill-conceived was not grounds for refusal. Soldiers who refused orders were prosecuted and often imprisoned. Some soldiers deserted. Desertion rates increased in the later years of the war. Many deserters fled to Canada or Sweden. The military classified desertion as a criminal offense. Some deserters remained fugitive for years. A general amnesty was offered in the 1970s, but it required deserters to accept alternative service or face continued legal consequences. Many did not return. The soldiers who refused orders or deserted were often characterized as cowards. Some were. Others were responding rationally to conditions they considered untenable. The distinction was rarely made. The South Vietnamese government that the United States supported was authoritarian, corrupt, and unstable. Successive coups replaced one military regime with another. The most stable leader, Nguyen Van Thieu, ruled from 1967 to 1975. His government was sustained by American aid. Corruption within the South Vietnamese military and bureaucracy was pervasive. Officers purchased their commissions. Supplies intended for soldiers were sold on the black market. Ghost soldiers, fictional personnel whose pay was collected by officers, inflated unit rosters. American advisors were aware of these problems. Reports documenting corruption were sent to MACV and Washington. The reports did not result in significant reform. The United States continued to provide aid because there was no alternative government. The goal was stability, not democracy. Thieu's government was repressive. Political opposition was suppressed. Journalists were censored. Dissidents were imprisoned. The South Vietnamese population was not uniformly supportive of the government. Many were indifferent. Some supported the Viet Cong not out of ideological commitment, but because the Saigon government offered them nothing. The United States framed the war as a defense of freedom. The government being defended did not embody that principle. American soldiers in Vietnam often did not know why they were fighting. The official explanation was to prevent the spread of communism. That explanation was abstract. It did not correspond to the lived experience of patrolling hostile villages where everyone was a potential threat and no ground was permanently held. Soldiers asked what they were accomplishing. The answers they received were vague. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Victory was measured in body counts that seemed disconnected from any strategic objective. The war felt circular. Units moved through the same terrain repeatedly with no lasting change. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong could retreat, regroup, and return. American forces could not. They were bound by the requirement to operate within South Vietnam. The enemy had no such restriction. The sense of futility was widespread among combat troops by 1969. Letters home reflected confusion and frustration. Morale declined steadily. Soldiers counted days until rotation home. Survival became the primary objective. The mission became secondary. The Christmas bombing of 1972 was a concentrated air campaign against North Vietnam designed to force concessions during peace negotiations. The bombing was called Operation Linebacker 2. It lasted 11 days. Over 20,000 tons of ordnance were dropped on Hanoi and Haiphong. The bombing included the use of B-52 strategic bombers in mass formations over heavily defended urban areas. 15 B-52s were shot down. The operation achieved its immediate objective. North Vietnam returned to negotiations and signed the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973. The accords did not end the war. They ended American involvement. The terms allowed North Vietnamese forces to remain in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government was not consulted on key provisions. The United States withdrew its combat forces and reduced aid. South Vietnam continued fighting for 2 more years. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon. The South Vietnamese government collapsed. The American embassy was evacuated by helicopter. The images of helicopters lifting off from the embassy roof became the defining visual conclusion of the war. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not formally recognized as a diagnosis until 1980. Vietnam veterans exhibited symptoms for years before the condition was acknowledged. Veterans reported nightmares, hypervigilance, flashbacks, emotional numbness, and difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. Many self-medicated with alcohol or drugs. The Veterans Administration was unprepared to address the psychological needs of returning soldiers. Mental health services were limited. The cultural attitude toward psychological trauma was dismissive. Veterans were often told to move on. Some were accused of fabricating symptoms. The lack of recognition and treatment contributed to high rates of homelessness, suicide, and incarceration among Vietnam veterans. It took decades for the institutional response to improve. The delayed recognition of PTSD meant that a generation of veterans suffered without adequate support during the years when intervention would have been most effective. The Pentagon Papers were a classified Department of Defense study on American involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The study was completed in 1969. It revealed that multiple administrations had systematically misled the public and Congress about the war's progress, objectives, and costs. The study documented that President Johnson escalated the war while publicly stating he sought no wider conflict. It showed that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was used to justify expanded military action, was based on flawed intelligence and an exaggerated threat. Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who had worked on the study, leaked it to the New York Times in 1971. The Times began publishing excerpts. The Nixon administration obtained a court order to halt publication, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the newspaper. The Pentagon Papers confirmed what many suspected. The war had been prosecuted under false pretenses. The public had been deceived. The disclosure did not end the war, but it deepened public distrust of government institutions. That distrust persisted. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. The accords stipulated a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American forces, and the return of prisoners of war. They did not require North Vietnamese forces to leave South Vietnam. The accords were presented as peace with honor. They were a face-saving mechanism for American withdrawal. North Vietnam had no intention of honoring the ceasefire. Fighting resumed within weeks. The United States provided South Vietnam with assurances of continued support. Those assurances were not fulfilled. Congress reduced military aid to South Vietnam in 1974. The reduction was substantial. The South Vietnamese military, which had been built to operate with American logistical and air support, could not sustain itself without that support. When North Vietnam launched its final offensive in 1975, South Vietnamese forces collapsed rapidly. The United States did not intervene. The war ended with the fall of Saigon. American personnel were evacuated. South Vietnamese allies were left behind. Thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with Americans were imprisoned in re-education camps. Many died there. The United States did not honor its implied commitments. The war was over. The obligations were not. Approximately 58,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam. Over 300,000 were wounded. The Vietnamese death toll, including combatants and civilians from both North and South Vietnam, is estimated between 2 and 3 million. The exact number is unknown. The war displaced millions more. Unexploded ordnance remains scattered across Vietnam. People are still killed by landmines and bombs decades after the war ended. The environmental damage from defoliation persists. The political consequences of the war shaped American foreign policy for a generation. The war demonstrated the limits of military power when strategic objectives are unclear and public support is absent. It also demonstrated that wars can continue long after their purpose has dissolved. American combat involvement lasted 8 years. The institutional commitment lasted longer. Funding, Training and support continued even as the rationale collapsed. The war did not end because it was won or lost. It ended because it could not be sustained. The distinction mattered to those who had to justify the costs. It did not matter to those who paid them. On April 30th, 1975, the last American helicopter lifted off from the embassy in Saigon. North Vietnamese tanks entered the city hours later. The war was over. It had been over for years.